Let me start by saying that none of this is an attack on Sabine Hossenfelder. I am a frequent watcher and a fan of Sabine's, but I also loved Bill Nye the Science Guy as a kid, and he too has a history of putting his foot in his mouth with regards to discussing philosophy. I will be speaking directly to Sabine's video, Has Physics Ruled Out Free Will?, released in June 3rd, 2023. So if the pacing and direction of this video doesn't seem well organized, know that it is a response that watching Sabine's video first may give you the needed context for. So the first section isn't terribly convincing because philosophically you aren't accounting for the heuristics of empiricism. Empiricism and the scientific method themselves are designed to find things that are deterministic. Reproducibility, falsifiability, things like this are designed to find and determine things while disregarding exceptions as flaws of method or reasoning. Once a valid exception is found, the theories change to understand how the flaw can be reproduced and categorized as deterministic. Things that can be done reliably, have utility, has an influence on what is accepted as empirical truth. However, you use rationalism to create a shift in the statements. We haven't done the math because the scale of the math is impossible, but we can still assume the conclusion of what the math would do if we did it. That isn't empiricism anymore, that's philosophy. You've made the same rationalist assumption when you bring up the decoupling of scales. Without a theory of everything that solves the divide between randomness and possibility in quantum physics to the determinism of general relativity, you are arguing that emergent behaviors necessarily follow from quantum physics, but one of two outcomes can be concluded. One, if quantum physics does have randomness that could result in an emergent top-down causation, you can disregard it because of the decoupling of scales. Or, you argue two, if quantum physics is deterministic, as you have argued, then you cannot disregard it because any emergent behavior would also have to be deterministic. Your argument here has thus rendered itself completely non-producible and unfalsifiable. If these were an empirical argument, it would be rejected for being impossible to test using the scientific method. As it is in fact a rationalist argument, we cannot ignore the fundamental assumptions. The decoupling of scales is not itself a physical law, it is a logical razor. It is an Occam's razor that says humanity has found more than one accurate enough way of modeling the universe, so we use easier, simpler models when doing stuff in specific contexts. The decoupling of scales does not say that those physics stop mattering to physics. Our rational use of stuff says that it is unnecessary and impractical to use all of physics in every context. So I can only agree with combining your 2 points from the emergence section by saying that quantum physics does have randomness that could result in emergent top-down causation, but our current methods lack a way to account for quantum behavior at a macroscopic scale, thus it cannot be verified nor dismissed empirically. That is how you make a rationalist argument about an open question of empiricism that takes into account that our current methods of science have a heuristic toward determinism. It is not logical to say that quantum physics, if it is indeterministic, can be disregarded because of the coupling of scales, but then also to say that if quantum physics is deterministic, it must be regarded despite the decoupling of scales. You can't use the one that just happens to support your already pre-existing belief. At the end of the emergence section, you then say mathematical constructions that were actually done that demonstrate emergent behaviors using infinities should be dismissed because there are no real infinities in nature. This runs exactly counter to the assumption you would have us make that if we ran all the math of all the probabilities of a human body and its surrounding environment, that we would accurately predict the future of that body. You would have us assume that the result is exactly predictable and that the math accurately represents physics and the human body necessarily. Yet when actual math is done to show the possibility of emergent properties, you must then have us assume that math does not represent physics and should be dismissed because it lends itself to the possibility of emergent phenomena? From a rationalist standpoint, you cannot both argue for the Platonic number and deny the Platonic number in the same argument. Your argument needs to be consistent in holding that math is itself physical law, or that mathematics are rational representations of our best efforts at utilizing what we have measured. You must not assume the equations would be true in a new context in one case, and then dismiss actual mathematics as false in a new context without measurement for the other case. There could be unaccounted for infinities in probability or in space, all because we do not yet have the tools to engage with quantum mechanics on a large enough macro scale. Thus, we cannot yet empirically test it. If we were somehow able to measure a sum total of all probabilities within a certain system, we might reach a certain macro scale enough such that we have a functional infinity, that we have a mathematical limit, despite it being technically a fixed amount, simply by matters of scale. Which is to say that this dismissal of infinities is itself why your arguments here can only be criticized from a rationalist perspective, because you have proposed something which cannot be tested. So in the free will section, you start off a bit better because we are actually trying to define the thing that is being argued against. But the one definition you offer is could have done otherwise. And that is a nice start, but that in itself has an empirical determinist bent to it. We are already discussing an occurrence of the past and measuring what has already happened, because we are using a past tense contingent conjugation of our words. You use this photon's 50-50 chance of going left or right example to say that it is strange to describe light as having free will, thus holds that the definition of free will is strange for being applied to a particle. But why must we treat that as strange? Empiricism helps us to say that a photon has a probability range, not why the photon has a probability range. Empiricism is not useful for describing why. It cannot ask the question that a rationalist perspective can. Is a photon, the matter and the energy in general, imbued with some kind of reason, essence, power, soul? Many words have been used throughout history that gives that photon the properties of an observer, that the photon itself picks where it goes in its range of probability. From there, if you hadn't already dismissed emergent behavior, we may then seriously question if a sufficiently chaotic arrangement of particles could use that property to direct the whole system's ranges of probability by even some minor degree, and if so, is that essentially the same as the concept of free will? It is not reasonable to assume particles do not have free will simply because you find it strange to apply the concept of free will to a particle. The limits of your inland empire to accept a world that is strange and unlike how we imagine it to be is not a problem for the world to solve for you, and it is not a reason to dismiss it. The rationalist with an experimental penchant would happily say, how about, for fun, we assume the particle does indeed have a particle's worth of free will. What does that mean from there? How would the world be if it were true? How would our definition of free will have to change to accommodate that idea? And it is questions like these that form the basis by which we can try to test things from different perspectives, using weird questions in the practices and logic of empiricism to find new, specific, and different contexts for understanding physics, the decoupling of scales. It is also not an empirical statement to say, let's assume particles do not have free will, therefore it is true that particles do not have free will. Again, I remind you, you are squarely making rationalist arguments, not empirical ones, so we have no other means by which to discuss this. Sabine, you then move on to an actual discussion of the philosophy of the concept of free will, but I will reiterate that thinking about photons in this way is strange is not a good basis for a conclusion. Sabine actually does a good job describing the compatibilist stance on free will here, but then just strangely moves past it. She doesn't question what the compatibilist's definition of free will actually is, and when she describes the compatibilist Daniel C. Dennett's account for an emergent behavior of the brain to create and then choose from among its range of imagined possibilities, she does not address how that is incompatible with what she has said before in this video. My major issue with compatibilism is that most compatibilist ideas are actually either incompatible with free will or incompatible with determinism, while claiming to be so compatible with both. From her initial description, Sabine's characterization of Dennett doesn't seem to make that same error. Compatibilists do not agree that free will does not exist. They usually just use information gained from physics to find new understandings of the phenomena of free will, rather than saying we are purely determined and that rational thought is an irrelevant or vestigial byproduct. We do not need to address the libertarian section. It was rather short, it was dismissive, and personally I don't know if it was representative of the libertarian school of thought on free will, and personally I don't even know how libertarian this is, if it's relevant to the political libertarians or not, so I will also skip it since I wasn't given enough information about it to know anything about it from Sabine's video. But we do need to address the non-physical free will section, as while some will represent it as spiritual, this category of Sabine's likely also includes, erroneously, those arguments that account for the limits and the functions of empiricism itself as a form of knowledge-making. Any dismissal of this account is an assumption that science itself is a spiritually inscrutable correctness, and not recognizing that science too is just one rational tool that we flawed humans created with our meat brains to better understand things. Then she makes a very quick, very poor argument about the definition of a free will denier. She says that she is not a free will denier because she does acknowledge that other people believe in free will, then immediately says that she believes free will does not exist. This is Sabine's worst rationalist argument in the whole piece because it is so simple and so wrong about the most pedantic and unnecessary inclusion. Sabine conflates the terms free will belief denier and free will denier as being the same, unless this was done on purpose as some kind of rhetoric to show that she isn't being unreasonable. But how could she make the mistake of the difference between belief in an idea and the physical truth of the idea? That is what this whole video is about in the first place. And saying that you don't deny other people's belief is not the same thing as saying that you don't deny free will, when you are, in fact, then saying immediately that you do deny free will. You're inconsistent. Her definition for herself, for her belief, of hard incompatibilism is entirely flawed, but explains why Sabine does not once actually discuss what free will is in the entire length of the video. Because her argument goes, I have denied that free will is compatible with either determinism or indeterminism, so it must not exist. Therefore, I have no need to consider what free will is. Let me make a parallel argument. I have decided that I will never eat a hot dog, so they no longer exist to me. Therefore, if someone brings me a food and says it is a hot dog, it still doesn't exist, and I don't have to look at it. Again, this is an issue of Sabine's willingness to imagine or engage with the idea. Just as she started the video with saying she doesn't find this idea very interesting and doesn't care, she ends this section by saying she doesn't care, doesn't have to engage, and therefore her assumptions of it not being true must be correct. Quote, whatever it isn't compatible with the laws of physics, end quote. As a statement, denies only the label of the words free will and not anything to do with the content of the ideas themselves. It is purely semantic and both rationally and empirically useless to the progress of philosophy and science, because if someone brought to Sabine an idea that was compatible with the laws of nature, but labeled it free will, she would say, well, whatever that is, it's not compatible, because whatever it is, whatever meaning anything that it could be, can't be compatible. Regardless of the idea, regardless of the definition, can't be compatible. No matter what you say, it won't be. That kind of statement is purely anti-intellectualism. And I am truly sorry for Sabine that because of her position as a well-known science communicator, she has been in the position of having to manage the trauma of strangers that speak to her at public events. That isn't fair. That isn't a thing that should happen. However, In giving her description of how we traditionally describe the use of free will, she also commits another faux pas common to philosophers and science communicators. She compares the brain to the most advanced technology of the time. In this case, it's computer algorithms, and not just computers, which is also done in the runtime of the video. Before, there have also been mechanical models, fluid models, steam engine models of the brain. These are not good ways to describe what the brain is, because the technology that we ourselves have made are not, in fact, brains, nor functioning like brains. Our technology works differently than the brain. Algorithms are not alive, nor thinking, nor aware, and the definition of artificial intelligence itself has constantly shifted between technology that mimics behavior with pre-written scripts and responding to inputs, technology that mimics prediction by multiplying sets of probabilities, and technology that mimics artistic creation through noisy regurgitation of stolen art. To compare our brains to an algorithm is just as flawed as to say the algorithms we make work the same way as our brains. They are different. Wittgenstein saying that our brains make predictions, but that empirical knowledge comes after the fact, does not support your point here, and is a mischaracterization of Wittgenstein's argument. Wittgenstein's own work in The Problem of Semantics, Creating Philosophical Conflicts Where There Need Be None, would, in my opinion, function as a scathing critique of Sabine's purposefully unwillingness to engage with different concepts of free will, while simultaneously asserting without evidence that all conceptions must not exist. From an empirical perspective, a neurophysicist would endeavor to describe the brain as the brain itself, not a facsimile of some other metaphor, but since this section was extensively about what sort of professional Sabine is not, perhaps we should also highlight that she is not a neurophysicist. She then says that free will not existing is good because it means everything that happens follows from what we want as people. But where is her definition of wanting? Wanting could be a matter of will. Is wanting an impulse to keep a computer machine going? Then why would a machine want to do something that destroys itself, like suicide, war, or martyrdom? Or is wanting also compatible with things directly counter to self-preservation? And if so, what is her account of the human machine to have been designed in a way to not self-preserve, as one would assume in most Darwinian evolutionary models? See, even a small throwaway line like Sabine's wanting a thing, without curiosity about free will, opens up a plethora of unanswered questions and assumptions about physics and biology. The argument is haphazard at best. She then says that we do in fact make decisions without free will, despite somehow also being deterministic, but gives us no definition of what a decision is or how it is made. So if her issue with the term free will comes from the word free, and how would we know that? Her complete disengagement from any definition of the term means we have no idea about what exactly she is arguing against with this video. She ends that section by supporting that everything was not determined by the Big Bang because quantum fluctuations created probabilities that weren't yet determined. But this statement drops her own point from earlier on that the actual outcomes of quantum probability is determined if we just did the math. So there is an inconsistency here in this argument as well. With her final section of Why Does It Matter, Sabine starts with the statement that the brain will process input no matter what, and that we are not as free as we may think we are. This, I think, reveals that Sabine's issue with free will is in fact a semantic problem with the word free. She defines free as being without any bounds or inputs. She subconsciously does not accept any usage of the word free that may account to limits, probabilities, and environmental influences on closed systems. But because she herself refuses to engage with the semantics of the word free, she is not able to communicate that this is her unstated assumed definition of the word free. Oh, the irony of her quoting Wittgenstein when the underlying issue of this entire video was a semantic problem with the first half of the term she refused to seriously explore for definition. Wittgenstein truly did solve philosophy, didn't he? She then also conflates the concept of will with magical thinking by saying climate activists that use the language of will are not also advocating for practical measures and regulations to actually address the issue. Again, a semantic problem with seeing all usage of the word will as being synonymous with magical thinking, instead of seeing that will can also mean decision and action. The statement that an individual is not personally responsible for addressing the systems of our society that create climate change is compatible with the statement that we must encourage the decision makers, the businesses, and the governments that fund the human activities that influence climate change must have the will to change those systems and to do otherwise, to do differently from what they have been doing in the past. The systems do not operate without people, without decision-making capability operating them. If humans disappeared tomorrow, the systems of burning fossil fuels for transportation and energy, or deforestation for real estate development, would also cease. But since humans will not magically disappear tomorrow, the remedy is socially influencing powerful people to change their decision-making. Your semantic uncomfortability with the word will does not give you a better understanding of that concept of environmentalism, nor would an acceptance of any definition of the word will hinder a person's understanding of that environmentalist concept, because believing the word will has a useful definition outside of magical thinking does not make a person rationally impotent. You have conflated environmentalism with strict determinism. For no reason, because this environmentalist argument was irrelevant to the topic of the definition of the word of free will. In summary, Sabine's entire discussion of the concept of free will circles around a complete lack of interest in the subject, nor holding any desire to entertain the subject from new perspectives. It is purely a semantic dismissal of the need to discuss the words of the topic at all, that defaults to using other words to essentially take the place of the exact words she wishes to dismiss. There is no substance in the commentary on ideas about free will because she is hung up on her unstated definition of the word free, her unstated definition of the word will, and her unstated definition of what those two words would mean together. It is a semantic dismissal without a willingness to actually engage in any semantics, without a willingness to engage in the idea behind the words. And if you are going to comment on the philosophy of semantics, such as when quoting Wittgenstein, you ought to be willing to have both that conversation and the conversation about the possible ideas themselves once the semantics have been settled. Sabine is a physicist. There is no need for her to comment on the topic of free will if she does not find it interesting. I would not consult a person with no interest whatsoever in the ideas within the word fishing, nor any interest in fishing, about the topic of fishing. Nor would I want such a person to release a 20-minute video saying that discussing fishing is meaningless. It is entirely valid to instead say, I have no interest in the topic of free will and do not wish to comment on it, which was the impetus and the conclusion of this video regardless. Should Sabine simply not talk about the thing she has no interest in talking about, then she would never need to speak about it again, rather than wasting everyone's time with a semantic argument that masquerades as empirically informed. Again, I'm sorry that I am so salty with this video. I do not make these kinds of videos often, but scientists diving headlong into dismissal of the usefulness or the very purpose of engaging with topics of philosophy is terribly frustrating, because there need not be a divide between the different relationships between how philosophy functions and inspires science, and how science functions and inspires new philosophy. It is just such an old dismissal with a new quote of a lack of semantics as the paint. Thank you for listening to this, and stay true.